Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Easy EdTech Podcast. My name is Monica Burns, and I am so glad that you're here to join me today. If you want to make the most of education technology, aka EdTech, well, you are in the right place. My goal has always been to help make EdTech easier and give you ideas you can try yourself, share with a colleague, or bookmark for later in the school year. Every Tuesday here on the Easy EdTech Podcast, you'll hear stories from my time in the classroom, the work I do now with schools and districts, and my travels to different EdTech events. Get ready for solo episodes where I share some quick tips and stories, and interviews full of practical ideas and stories from new guests each month. If we mention something you'd like to check out, make sure to click the link. You'll find it in the episode description or the summary area where you're listening to this podcast, or you can find every episode and all of the resources we mention by going to classtechtips.com/podcast, or by going to classtechtips.com and just clicking on the Easy EdTech Podcast button at the top of the page. This episode is sponsored by my quick reference guide using AI chatbots to enhance planning and instruction, published by ASCD and ISTE. It's full of quick tips educators can use, and Amazon almost always has it on sale. Just search for me, Monica Burns, on Amazon to see all of my books and quick reference guides. But please remember that there are 2 authors named Monica Burns on Amazon, and I'm pretty sure you'll be able to tell the difference between our books. Just head to Amazon, search Monica Burns, and you'll find my quick reference guide using AI chatbots to enhance planning and instruction. This week's episode is titled Over a Dozen Poetry Month Ideas to Try This Spring. Now, this episode goes live in February, but spring is around the corner, at least fingers crossed. That's how I feel here in the Northeast after our snowy enough winter. But April is National Poetry Month, and if it is a time to celebrate in your classroom, school, or district, well, then I've got over a dozen ideas for you. Now, you don't have to be in an ELA, English Language Arts environment for today's podcast. I've got some cross-curricular connections and some super short activities that you can use to infuse some poetry into the work that you are doing with students or the work that you are doing to support teachers. So we're going to go through in today's episode some ways that you might introduce this medium of writing poetry to students, or to give them a taste of what's possible as poets. So if you've come across this episode when it goes live in February, awesome, you're way ahead of the game, ready for it. If this popped into your feed or you came across it in March or April, awesome. And if you have just maybe scrolled back a bit, maybe you're new to the podcast and you don't get them downloaded in your feed just yet when they go live, maybe it's October when you're listening to this and sometime way off in the future. Well, of course, you could use these ideas any time of year. April being Poetry Month, it's just often a time that we're looking for some things that relate to poetry. So let's jump into the list of a handful, over a dozen activities that you might try. All right, so before we get into the first one, just a reminder that you can totally customize these for different grade levels or writing goals or student interests. If you're not quite sure how to customize these, head over to a chatbot. Maybe it's ChatGPT or Gemini and say, here's the idea I heard. How can I customize this for? And then put in a little info about your group. All right, so number 1 is found poetry. For a hands-on experience, something that isn't quite online, at least not at the start, you can provide some magazines, newspapers, whatever you've got that has words printed out on it for students to explore. They can cut out words or phrases and rearrange them creatively to form some new poems. If you do want a digital spin, of course, you could encourage students to snap a picture and record their voice where they read or perform their poem or talk a little bit about the choices that they made. You could do this with a few different tools. Maybe it's something like CSAP, where they record that voice over their picture or even jump on video themselves. If you don't have lots of newspapers and magazines around, you may want to try the next idea on the list, which is magnetic poetry. You can create a classroom poetry corner with magnetic word sets. Kids can make poems collaboratively, individually, and maybe even using a space like a baking sheet, right? So that's a great option. And if you don't have another part of your room that's magnetic, it's also portable and can keep all your magnetic poetry in one spot. Next up is acrostic poems, definitely a favorite. Kids can compose acrostic poems where each line of the poem begins with a letter from a chosen word. Sometimes we do like names, but that can be a little tough with students that have different lengths of names. So maybe you choose an April-ish or spring theme or something that connects to a historical figure that you're studying, just to kind of level the playing field for everyone. It's a great way to get kids' wheels spinning. It gives them some structure for the poems that they write. And for a techie twist, you might have them all jump into Book Creator. It's a favorite. I've done some work with their team and always love this one. And so with Book Creator, you might have them each make their own page, and then you can combine the pages to make a class digital book with Book Creator. Super easy to share. If you don't use Book Creator yet, you can totally do the free version for collaborative books. It's a great option. Or maybe you just check out something like Google Slides. Next on the list is sensory poems. You might encourage kids to do a close observation to describe something using all or a couple of the 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, you name it. You can ask them to choose one sense and write a poem based on that interaction. This is great if you have kids exploring outdoor spaces in spring, if you want them to use descriptive language, or maybe you're even connecting back to a science topic, like having kids hold different types of rocks or gems, right? So lots of ways to customize this for your group. If you want to make a techie connection, kids might jump into a Padlet space and record themselves reading their poem using the video tool inside of Padlet. Next on the list is an artist inspiration. You can share some famous paintings or other art pieces. Maybe you find them in a spot like Google Arts and Culture. Kids can then write poems that respond to their observations or their emotions, or maybe even imagine stories that they write up inspired by the artwork. Google Arts and Culture is a great option for this. You can search for all different types of art pieces, but you could even go to a museum's website and find some things there too. So far on our list of Poetry Month ideas, we've got found poetry, magnetic poetry, acrostic and sensory poems, and some artist inspiration. Next up is limericks. These are short, usually silly, funny poems that have a really specific rhythm and rhyme scheme, A-A-B-B-A. So you might introduce kids to generative AI, like the text-to-image tool in Adobe Express, and have them create their own silly AI-generated image to go along with their limerick. I like this as a student-facing choice for using generative AI because it's built into a K-12 friendly tool. But if you're not using something like that, you might have kids write limericks and then ask them to write one description of where their limerick takes place or something like that. And then you can pop it into a tool to make an image. Next up is picture prompt poetry. So like I mentioned, your kids might not be using generative AI themselves, but maybe you use a tool like Adobe Firefly to create some unique images for them. I love Express. I love Adobe Firefly. This January and February, and I've actually got one the first week of March too. I'm leading creativity institutes for the Adobe team, so super fan. But you might make your own images, and then kids can choose one of the creations, one of the pictures you made for inspiration, and write accompanying poems that go along with each one. You could even turn this into a cool bulletin board where maybe there's 3 different pictures you've made, and kids can put the poems that go along with each one next to that image. You could also do a special guest event. So our next idea is a guest poet visit. You can invite a local poet or someone who writes poems as a hobby to visit your class in person or virtually. In my book, EdTech Essentials, I have a chapter about connections and, this idea of virtual connections like guest speakers. So great way to bring someone who might not be able to make the trip, right? Or is a couple time zones away. You could have kids read their poems, their poetry ahead of time, prepare questions, or maybe even share some of their poems with that guest poet. Speaking of sharing, the next idea on the list is a poetry performance. You can organize an event where kids perform original poems or poems that they picked out and that they love. And if your students are hesitant to perform in front of an audience, understandable if it's totally new to them, you could provide them with the option to make a movie, maybe using a tool like iMovie or Apple Clips, and then they've got that little video instead. During the month of April, you might try this next idea, which is word of the day poetry. You can pick one word every day during that month of April, Poetry Month, and encourage kids to incorporate it into a short poem or maybe a metaphor or simile. If you're looking at different types of descriptive language, you can connect it to those goals. And this could be a commitment to a cross-curricular connection too. For example, you might try this like as a do now activity and choose words that relate to a social studies or science topic, and then ask kids to write a poem with that word. We've got just a couple more ideas on the list for your consideration. Hopefully not doing all of them, but maybe choosing 1 or 2 to try or to recommend to a colleague. And next up for us is poetry stations. You can set up various poetry stations for kids to rotate through during Poetry Month. For example, you might have a haiku station, one for magnetic poetry, like I mentioned earlier, one with picture prompts, or with another Poetry Month activity that I talked about in today's episode. Kids can rotate, experiment with different poetic forms with using whatever time you put on the clock. So it might be 5 minutes, it might be 7 minutes, it might be 12, all right? And then they rotate and explore that different type of poetry. Now, you might also decide that you want to take a spin on some well-loved or popular poems and do some poem parodies. You can select some poems or nursery rhymes that kids may already know or that are well-known and worth sharing with them, and then have kids write their own silly versions. You might even make some of your own silly versions to share with them using a tool like Gemini or ChatGPT to get a little extra help. I do have a free download on my website. If you're looking for some AI or ChatGPT tips, just go to classtechtips.com. That's my website. Tap on the free stuff button at the top and you'll find it there. Now, as we move towards the end of our list, we've shared a bunch already. All right, we looked at those first few, then jumped into limericks, picture prompt poetry, guest poet visit, poetry performance, word of the day poetry, poetry stations, poem parodies, and I've got one more for you, which is musical poems. And don't worry, I've got the whole transcript and this full list on the blog for you to access after today. So if you want some help composing a score to go along with a class poem, you might decide to get a little extra help from an AI tool. Music FX is one I like. Suno is another. If you've joined me for a keynote or workshop this year, you may have seen both of them in action. And these are AI-powered tools where you describe the kind of music you want to play. Maybe you describe the mood and the instruments, and then it creates a custom tune, and it can go along with whatever poetry you are sharing with your class. Now, there you have it, over a dozen ideas for you to celebrate National Poetry Month. A great reason to bring some poems into your classrooms, whether it's a cross-curricular connection or maybe April is always the month that you focus on some poetry. So let's make this EdTech easy with a few key points from today's episode. Try found poetry with magazines or newspapers and share with a tool like Seesaw. Use a digital tool like Book Creator for collaborative poetry projects. Inspire poems with unique AI-generated images. Encourage creativity with poetry performances or short videos. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from this episode by heading to classtechtips.com/podcast and finding today's episode, number 308. This episode is sponsored by my quick reference guide using AI chatbots to enhance planning and instruction, published by ASCD and ISTE. It's full of quick tips educators can use, and Amazon almost always has it on sale. Just search for me, Monica Burns, on Amazon to see all of my books and quick reference guides. But please remember that there are 2 authors named Monica Burns on Amazon, and I'm pretty sure you'll be able to tell the difference between our books. Just head to Amazon, search Monica Burns, and you'll find my quick reference guide using AI chatbots to enhance planning and instruction. Thank you for listening to this new episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. I love creating new episodes for you each week, but I could use a bit of help spreading the word about the podcast. Can you leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app? Spotify will let you tap on the stars, and Apple Podcasts will let you tap on the stars and leave a 1 or 2 sentence review. Thank you so much for taking this extra step. It helps other educators find episodes like this one when they're searching for EdTech tips.